Hello everybody! In this spreadsheet tutorial we're going to go over how to create all the different basic chart types using LibreOffice Calc. For our first example, let's go over how to create a column chart. It is common to use column charts to help you compare items and to visualize those comparisons, just like we've done here with this sales data column chart. So we created this chart using this data. We have some sales regions and some units sold data that correspond to each region. Now let's go ahead and delete this chart and go over how we created it. So you can select your data like this, or you can select part of your data and it will select it for you. To insert your chart, go up here to your toolbar and you want to look for the icon that looks like a little pie chart. Let's go ahead and click it. Our first option are the column charts. Now within the column charts we have three options: normal, stacked, and percent stacked. We're going to use the normal. We're going to click next. And if you ever need to change the way your chart looks, one way you can do that is to change your data series from columns to rows. But we can see from our preview that our chart looks just fine as is. So we can go ahead and click next. This all looks good, so we can click next. Now, to add the title, we'll click in the title box here and we'll call this sales data. We don't need a subtitle. Let's go ahead and add an X and Y axis label. For the X axis, we'll just call that the regions, and for the Y axis, that is the units sold. If you want your legend to be in a different place, you can choose that here, left, right, top, bottom. If you don't want the legend, uncheck the box. You can see it changes the chart. However, let's just leave our legend on the right. Now we can click Finish. And we have our first basic column chart. So from this column chart, we can see that the West has the most units sold and the South has the least. Now on to our second example. So to create these charts here, we used this data. This chart is a pivot table chart that we created from a pivot table here, and we created the pivot table using this data. This chart here used this data, and we just simply copied and pasted this data from our pivot table. Now you'll notice that in general these charts look the same. However, the pivot table chart looks a little bit different and it gives you a few more options and it allows you to interact with your chart a little bit more. So let's go ahead and delete all these charts and the pivot table and the data and go ahead and start from scratch. Okay, so let's start with this data here and let's insert our pivot table. We can go up here to the Insert Pivot Table icon. Let's click it. The current selection is fine. Let's hit OK. Let's drag our years to the columns and you can get rid of this data that's selected in blue or leave it. It's not going to matter too much for this example. Let's drag our units sold to the data fields and the sales region to the row fields. We want to put this in the worksheet right here. So let's click this little plus next to source and destination. Click here for destination selection. Click inside the box and choose the cell you want to put it in. Now we can click OK. And we have our pivot table. Now one way to create our pivot table chart is just to simply select the data we want. Now let's go up to Insert Chart and we immediately get a preview of our pivot table chart. Let's go ahead and click Next. Let's go ahead and add a title. Sales data. The X-axis are the regions and the Y-axis are the units sold. Let's click Finish. Let's go ahead and drag this over and resize it a little bit. Now one cool thing that you can do, as we mentioned, with the pivot table chart is you can interact with it. So for example, you can click on this year drop down. Go ahead and select your chart first, then click on the drop down. And let's say we want to compare 2015 to 2017. So let's uncheck 16, click OK, and we have our comparison. You can do something similar with the sales region. And let's say we want to compare the east to the west. Let's unclick north and south, click OK, and we have our east and west comparison. Okay, so this chart is very similar to this chart, However, we added the time element here. So you can clearly see which region has the most sales, and you can see the trend of those units sold over time. So we can see that the West has the most sales, and they have gone up year over year. The South has the least, and they went up from 15 to 16, but then their sales went down in 17. Okay, so this is one way to create a pivot table chart using our pivot table data. Another way is to select the data you want, go ahead and copy it, and then paste special. And if you hover over this option, you can see it says values only, so click that. And now we can create a little bit more simple chart using this data. Let's go up to Insert Chart. Make sure the column is selected, and we'll just leave the title and labels off and click Finish. Okay, so basically these two charts are the same. However, this chart is created from the pivot table and it allows you to interact. And this chart is created from this values only data. Okay, next up, let's go over how to create a horizontal bar chart. Okay, so for the horizontal bar chart, we have some states data with all of the states in the US and their corresponding population. Using all of this data here, we created this horizontal bar chart and we sorted it from largest state to smallest state. Over here, we have another example with some time data, January through December, and the corresponding profit for each month. Now you'll notice in this chart, it's a little bit different because we have profits and losses, and where the losses occur, you can see that the bar goes into the negative numbers. So let's go ahead and delete this first chart, and let's go over how to recreate that horizontal bar chart. So we have part of our data selected, that should be okay. Go up to Insert Chart, it's going to select the data for us, and we immediately get a preview. We can see this is a column chart. We want to go ahead and select the bar chart. Now, very much like the column chart, you have three options: the normal, the stacked, and the percent stacked. Once again, let's just use the normal and click Next. Now, one thing we're going to want to change is we want to put the largest at the top and go down to the smallest, but we can change that here in just a little bit. So far, this looks okay, so let's click Next. This looks fine. Let's click Next. Now, for the title, let's call this POP, short for population, by state. Now, for the horizontal bar chart, this is just a little bit counterintuitive. Typically, the x-axis runs along like this, and the y-axis goes up and down. However, for this chart, that's not going to be the case. So for the x-axis, that's going to be the states, and you can see it appropriately puts the states where the states are. And for the y-axis, that's going to be the actual population. Now we can go ahead and click Finish. And let's drag this down a little bit. And let's make this chart bigger. Now the first thing we want to do is resize these state labels so we can see more of the states. So to do that, let's go ahead and select the chart and do a right click. Let's go to Format Axis. Then we want to go to the Font tab here, and let's go ahead and change the size to 8 and click OK. So that looks a little bit better. Let's make this even bigger. Let's try one more time and change it to 7 and see if we can get all the states. So that looks better. Now we want to sort this from the largest states to the smallest, from the top to the bottom. So to do that, once again, make sure you have your chart selected, right click, go to Format Axis. We want to go to Scale and click this reverse direction. Now let's click OK. And now we have our horizontal bar chart with all of the states by the population, largest to smallest. Next up, let's go over how to create this profit and loss horizontal bar chart. So let's go ahead and delete it. Let's select our data. Click Insert Chart, click the bar chart, let's leave it on the normal, let's click Next, go ahead and click Next again, everything looks fine. Next, let's add a title, let's just call this profit chart. The x-axis, let's title that time. And for the y-axis, let's give that the title of profit in dollars. Now again, remember on these horizontal charts, it may be a little bit confusing when you go in to put in the titles, but you'll be able to see that here when you update it and change it accordingly. Okay, now let's click Finish. And the first thing you'll notice is that these month labels are not in the right place. So let's go ahead and drag this down a little bit. Now to fix this, go ahead and select your chart, and let's go ahead and hover over the labels and right-click, go to Format Axis. Then we want to go to Positioning, and under the Labels, click this drop down and let's click Outside Start. Click OK. And you can see it moves the labels, and now we can see our chart and the comparisons much better. Next up, let's go over the pie chart. Here we have an example of a pie chart. It is common to use pie charts to show the proportions of a total. So in this example, we're going to show the time spent on an average day. So here we have the activity and then the distribution of time that corresponds to each of those activities. Now let's go ahead and delete this. To create the pie chart, select your data, go to Insert Chart. The pie chart is the third option down, and you have different options here, including the exploded pie chart, the donut chart, and the exploded donut chart. We're going to use the normal. Click Next. From a quick glance, we can see in our preview everything looks fine, so we don't need to change anything here. Click Next. Next again. For the title, let's just call this Time Spent Each Day, and let's click Finish. Now, one thing we might want to do is to put the specific percentages of the distributions that correspond to each part of the pie chart on the actual chart. So go ahead and double click, select your chart. Let's go ahead and right click, and then you want to go down to Insert Data Labels. And now we can see how a normal day might be broken up. 33% is spent sleeping, 8.3% is spent exercising, 17%, give or take, is free time, and then about 42% is spent working. Next up, we're going to go over how to create an area chart. Here we have our area chart example. It's common to use area charts to compare items over time, and they're somewhat similar to a filled-in line chart. So let's go over an example. We started out with this data here with some products and some times, and then the units sold that correspond to each of those products for that specific period in time. Next, we went ahead and created our pivot table, just like we did in our earlier example with the column chart. And also, just like with the column charts, you could create a pivot table chart with this pivot table data, or you could create a more simple chart with just the values from your pivot table. Now in this case, let's just create a more simple chart. So let's delete this area chart and show you how we did it. So what we did is we went ahead and copied this pivot table data and pasted it here with just the values. Now just a quick review to show you how to create the pivot table. You select your data, go up to Insert Pivot Table. The current selection is fine, click OK. Now for this one, we want the times as the rows, the product as the columns, and the units sold go in the data fields. Let's go ahead and put this in the existing worksheet, click OK. So you can see our pivot tables are identical. So if you want to recreate the pivot table, you can do it just how we showed. So let's go ahead and delete this one. Now, as we mentioned, we selected this data here, copied it, and pasted the values. Now let's go ahead and select this values data, go up to Insert Chart. Let's go to the fourth option down for the area. Now in this case, if you choose the normal, you're not going to be able to see all of your different categories compared, such as the computers, phones, and tablets. We want to go ahead to the second option and choose Stacked. Okay, so we can see the yellow are the tablets, the orange are the phones, and the blue are the computers. Let's go ahead and click Next. Everything looks fine, so we don't need to change any of this or this. Let's click next and let's put in a title. Let's just call this area chart. The x-axis are the years and the y-axis are the devices sold. Let's click finish. And here we have our area chart. If you wanted to create a pivot table chart, go ahead and select your data, insert, go to area, go ahead and select the stacked option here, and let's just click finish. Let's go ahead and drag this over, resize it, and you can see you get your drop downs, which allows you to interact with your chart and change things just a little bit more than you would with this chart. Okay, next up we're going to go over the line chart. In this worksheet we have some examples of line charts, and it's common to use line charts to show comparisons and trends over time. For our first example, here we have some very generic data with categories A, B, and C, and the months January through June. Let's go up to Insert Chart, go down to Line Chart, and we want the second option, Points and Lines. Let's go ahead and click Next. Now in this case, from our preview, this doesn't look quite right. So one way that we can fix this, we could rearrange this data, or we can click on Data Series in Rows. So let's go ahead and click that. And this looks more like what we want, because we want to compare the generic categories A, B, and C over time. Let's click Next. Everything looks fine. Next. And let's just give it a title. We'll call it Line Chart. The x-axis is the time, and the y-axis are the values. Let's click Finish. Let's drag our chart over a little bit and make it a little bit smaller. Okay, so that's a very basic line chart. Now let's move on to our second example. For this example, we started out with this data here. This is a little bit larger data set than in our previous examples. So we have some months and the years and a sales team and the units sold, where the units sold correspond to the sales team and the different time periods. And we have two sales teams. So what we want to do is see the comparison over time of Team 1 compared to Team 2. So the next thing we did is we created a pivot table from this data. Now just to show you how we created it, let's go ahead and click on it and right click and hit Edit Layout. So we put the sales team in the columns. We put the months in the rows field, and we put the sum of the units sold in the data field. Okay? Now, in this case, we went ahead and created a pivot table line chart. So let's go ahead and delete it, and let's select our data. So we're not going to select the total, we're just going to select the time and the teams. Let's go all the way down to the bottom and make sure we don't include the total at the bottom either. Now let's go up to Insert. Let's go to Line. Let's choose the second option. Now, if you did not want your points, you could choose this third option. So actually, that looks a little bit better. Let's choose that. Let's click Next. And let's just go ahead and give this the title Sales Teams. Now the x-axis is the time, and the y-axis are the units sold. Let's click Finish. Now if you did not want the pivot table chart, you could copy these and paste them as values and create the chart that way. Let's make this a little bit bigger. So we can see, overall, the Team 2 numbers are a little bit higher. Now occasionally, Team 2 dips below Team 1, but in general, it looks like Team 2 is doing a little bit better. Now another thing you might want to do is to add a trend line. To do that, go ahead and select your chart and then select the line. Now let's do a right click and you can see Insert Trend Line. Let's go ahead and leave the regression type as linear and hit OK. And let's go ahead and do the same thing for Team 1. So right click, Insert Trend Line. Okay, so that's how you can create a line chart. Next up, we're going to go over a scatter chart or a scatter plot. For our scatter plot example, we're going to compare study hours and exam scores and see if there's a relationship. So here's an example of what the chart will look like. Let's go ahead and delete it. Okay, so here we have our data. For each row in this data, this would be a test score for a student. And it shows the hours they studied and the exam score they received. So let's go ahead and select this data. Go to Insert Chart. Go to XY Scatter. We're going to leave it on points only. Let's click Next. From our preview, everything looks okay. And next, and next. Let's go ahead and make the title Study Hours versus Exam Scores. Now the x-axis is going to show the hours spent studying, and the y-axis is going to show the exam score. Let's go ahead and click Finish. And here we have our scatter plot. From a quick look at this scatter plot, it does look like there is a relationship between the number of hours studied and the higher scores. So you can see as the hours spent studying go up, so do the scores. Now let's go ahead and put in a trend line. So select your chart, select your data points, right-click, insert trend line. Let's just go ahead and leave it as the linear and hit OK. Now another thing you might want to do from time to time is to change these scatter plot symbols. Now to do that, go ahead and select your chart and select your symbols and do a right click. Go to Format Data Series. Then you want to go to Line. Then go to Icon. Go ahead and click on the Select drop down. Let's go to Symbols and let's change it to addition signs. You can also change the colors, so let's do that. Let's change it to red. Let's click OK. And you can see that our symbols changed to pluses and now they're red. Next up, we're going to go over how to create a bubble chart. Okay, so for our bubble chart example, we have some very simple generic data here. And you can think of a bubble chart basically as a scatter chart with an extra element, which usually denotes the size of the bubble. So if you were going to compare two things in a scatter plot, such as x and y, for the bubble chart you would add an extra element, we just call this z, and this denotes the size of the bubble. Now you can make this x, y, and z anything you want. A common thing to create bubble charts with include things like comparisons of GDP and lifespan and the population of a region or something like that. So let's go ahead and select this and delete it. Let's go ahead and select all of our data, go to Insert Chart, and we want the bubble chart option here. Next. From the preview, everything looks fine. Let's click Next. Next, and let's just call this bubble chart. Since our data in this example is generic, let's just label the x-axis as x-axis and the y-axis as y-axis. Now let's go ahead and click Finish. And now we have our bubble chart. Next up, let's go over the net chart. Okay, here we have some examples of the net chart, and these types of charts have many other different types of names that you might recognize. They're also called radar charts, spider charts, web charts, star charts, and the list goes on and on. These radar charts or net charts are often used to compare data for multiple variables. Okay, so let's go over an example. Here we have a ratings category for different vehicles. We have 3 vehicles that we want to compare, and we want to use a 1 through 5 scale where 5 is the best to rate these 3 vehicles based on these categories: fuel economy, reliability, comfort, design, and repair costs. So in this case, a higher number for the repair costs would be a better thing. That means they're lower repair costs. Okay, so here we have 2 examples. Now let's go ahead and delete these and show you how to recreate them. The first thing we want to do is select our data, go to Insert Chart, click the net here, And let's go ahead and choose the second option with the points and lines. Click Next. From our preview, everything looks fine. Click Next again, and let's give it a title. Let's call it Net Chart Dash Compare Vehicles. Now let's leave the subtitle and the axis labels blank and click Finish. Now the first thing we might want to do to make this just a little bit easier to read is we can see that this axis for our numbers 1 through 5 starts at 0 here and goes up to 5. Now what we want to do is go ahead and add those other increments for those numbers. So go ahead and click your chart, select your axis here, do a right click, go to Format Axis, and we want to go to Scale, and for the major interval, uncheck the automatic, and let's put that at an increment of 1. Okay, so that adds the increments. Now we can see just a little bit better where each of the different vehicles fall. So over here for our legend, we can see that vehicle 2 is the orange. And that car is the best for comfort and design. You can see that it falls on the outside and it gets a rating of 5. It also scores well for repair costs and reliability, and it gets a 4. Now, its fuel economy is not the best. It's average at 3. Okay? Now, if you're only concerned about repair costs, you might want to go with vehicle 3 because it has the best repair costs. And you can see that here with the vehicle 3, which is yellow. If you're concerned with fuel economy only, you might go with vehicle 1 because that is the blue line and that is the vehicle with the best fuel economy. So you really just have to look at the lines and look at the comparisons and see which categories you're most interested in, and then see what this type of chart and the visualization can tell you about the data. Now what's kind of interesting about this is vehicle 1 has the best fuel economy, its reliability is pretty good, it gets a 4, its comfort's pretty good, and its repair costs are average. But the design of it is not so great. But maybe the things that are most important to you are the fuel economy, reliability, and comfort. So that might be the car that you'd want. Okay, so that's our net chart or radar chart example. Next up, let's go over how you can create a stock chart. For our stock chart or candlestick chart example, here we have our data. And these types of charts are often used to help show stock performance. So we have our dates. And then for this stock, on these dates, we have the opening price, the high price, the low price, and the close price. And this is what the chart ends up looking like. If you're curious about how to read the chart, here we have some graphics here and here, which show you how to read this. Okay, so let's go ahead and delete the chart and select our data. Go up to Insert Chart. We want to go to Stock. And let's select the second option. Let's go ahead and hit Next. And Next. Everything looks good. Next. And we'll just call this Stock Chart. Now, the x-axis is the time, and the y-axis are the prices. Let's click Finish. And here we have our stock chart. Next up, we're going to go over the column and line chart, sometimes called the combination chart. For our last example, we have what is called sometimes a combination chart, or what LibreOffice Calc calls the column and line chart. And a common use for this type of chart is to compare some target measures to actual measures. So here we have our data with the time column, January through December. Then we have our actual units sold for each month versus the target units that we wanted to sell. This is what the column and line chart looks like. So let's go ahead and delete it. Let's select our data, insert chart, column and line. If you wanted to put in a stacked, you could do that. Let's just leave it on this first option. Click Next. Everything looks good in our preview. next, next, and we'll call this column and line chart. The x-axis is the time, and the y-axis are the units. Let's click Finish. So the columns are the actual units sold, and then the line, the orange line, are the targets. So you can see where the column is above the line, the goal was met or exceeded. Where the column doesn't meet the line, that's where the units sold fell a little bit short. Overall, it was all pretty close, but if you wanted to see the months where the actual units sold did not meet the goal, you could see that that would be January, March, August, September, October. Everything else looks like it met the target or exceeded the target. Okay, so that's all we have for this spreadsheet tutorial on how to create charts using LibreOffice Calc. We will be doing many more spreadsheet tutorials in the near future. Join us for those, and we'll see you next time.